Welcome to Stories from the Center of the Universe, the podcast about the human experience.
George Dunston, welcome to the Center of the Universe.
Thank you very much.
I guess we should mention how you and I reconnected, because it's been more than a couple of minutes.
Yes.
I think the last time you and I saw each other might have been in Charlottesville.
It was probably in Charlottesville. I think I was a first-year law student, and you were in Charlottesville for some reason. Unless you were you living in Charlottesville?
I was not living there, but I came back a few times just because, why not?
Yep.
I was only 22, 23. It's fun to come back.
Yes, great campus. A lot of fun. I think I ran into you one of those weekends you were back.
Yeah, and I think I was trying to extend my college experience. Is probably what I was doing without the academics.
Yeah. Well, I was at Charlottesville for law school, and that was probably extending my college experience with the academics.
Was law school? Well, I'm going to get into law school here in a second. We should mention that Tim McCoy, I think, is the reason we reconnected.
Yes.
When we did.
Yep.
I was eventually going to get to you because I've been thinking about reconnecting with a lot of our classmates. And he said, you've got to talk to George. I'm like, all right, great. He's the next classmate. I'm going to try to schedule. And you're in town. We're at St. Christopher's today.
Yes.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
And you're on the board.
Yes, I'm on the board of governors of St. Christopher's, along with Tim.
And Tim's the chairman.
Tim's going to be the incoming chairman.
Yeah, and I have to say, for the record on the recording, I'm not sure why you guys allowed that to happen. You don't have to comment. Yeah. I'll own my comment. You can stay commentless. All right, so you grew up in Hanover County like I did. Or
I actually grew up in Henrico County, but not too far away from where you grew up.
Near the line.
Exactly, right near the line, in Chamberlain Farms,
right
off of Diane Lane. So you just go a little bit further past Parham Road, and you're in Hanover. But technically, where I lived was in Henrico.
That's right. And your address was it Richmond?
No, my address was.
Because I lived near there.
Good question. Actually, yes, my address was Richmond.
Yeah, because I lived near there after college, and my address was Richmond.
Yeah, it was a Richmond address.
Yeah, but you weren't born here. Were you born elsewhere?
No, I was born in Piscataway, New Jersey.
Okay.
And that's where I lived the first 9 years of my life.
And you have memories of living there, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's where I started school. That's where I went to most of elementary school. And then I moved to Virginia when I was 9 years old.
Do you have fond memories of being in New Jersey as a young kid?
I do, actually. I mean, I lost my father when I was 7 years old while we were living in New Jersey. So there was that. But other than that, I enjoyed my time there. I remember having excellent elementary school teachers, being involved in a lot of different activities, Cub Scouts and things like that. And then we moved to Richmond. And my mother moved here to begin her residency. She had gone to medical school in New Jersey, and her residency opportunity was at MCV. And so that's all you moved to Richmond.
Okay. Losing a dad at such a young age, were there other people in your life back then that tried to fill that void for you?
There were. He had been a vice principal with the public school system there. So everyone in the school sort of knew what had happened to me and sort of looked out for me. And he had some very close friends that made sure to look in on me and, make sure that I was doing okay. But I do recall that community was very supportive of me, after what had happened.
Do you look back thinking what your life might have been like or how it could have been different if your dad had been around?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have been very different in where I lived and just in a number of different areas. It gives you a different perspective in a lot of different ways on life, and I think it ages you a bit prematurely. When I was younger, people would say, "Oh, you talk like an adult," and I think I did to a certain degree, but part of it was because I think I had to grapple with some fairly tough emotions fairly early on in life. But on the other hand, in some ways, and I've seen an article which talks about the impact of the death of a parent on a young child and how, although of course it's incredibly devastating, in some ways it can provide that child focus and direction in a number of ways as well. So For me, it's it's what happened, and I think, of course, it was a very impactful thing on my life, but it's something that I've learned, is to become part of my life and understand that, it's become part of, who I am. And I do try to think about him as I live my life and try to honor in some ways what I think he might have hoped for me. And, it's a tough thing to lose a parent as a young child.
I can't imagine. My dad's still around. I can't imagine growing up or even being a young adult without a dad around. And so you had the community that filled the void a bit.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah.
But they couldn't be dad.
No. It's I was all of a sudden I was living in a single parent household, and my mother was in medical school at the time. So she really had to study at times. When exam time in medical school came, we had to go stay with either relatives or close friends. So I spent a lot of time in other people's houses when I was younger. And and they were very wonderful people that took great care of us and were very accepting. But it was a lot of moving around. I wouldn't say, I didn't feel that it was unstable, but it was different. It wasn't come home, everyone's there. I think I learned a little bit about how you have to be resourceful and flexible by having to go through that time period.
Yeah, it's good and bad, right? You're being exposed to more people with more opinions and more life experiences, but
Exactly.
but mom's not around as maybe often as you'd like to do what moms traditionally or not so traditionally do.
Yeah, and when we moved down to Virginia, the great thing was that my grandmother lived here, and she really did a great job stepping in and taking care of us. Because again, my mother was in her internship and her residency, and she was away quite a bit, and she had to be on call. My grandmother, who lived right over by City Stadium, really took tremendous care of us, along with my aunt and uncle. So I spent a lot of time with her and with them.
Did your grandmother grow up here?
Oh, my grandmother grew up in St. Paul's, Virginia.
Okay.
And she was an orphan, unfortunately. And I believe she came here to work in Richmond as a housekeeper. I think back in that time in the 30s, they would bring people that were orphaned or whatever at a certain age to come in to work in homes in Richmond. And she worked in a house probably not too far away from here, I think, in Windsor Farms. And then she met my grandfather, who had grown up here in Richmond over in the Jackson Ward area. And they got married in the early 40s, I think, maybe 1942. And then they had my mother in 1943. And my mother always tells a story about my mother was born, and the next week or whatever, my grandfather got sent off to World War II.
Oh, wow.
to serve I believe he served in the Asian theater as an MP.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild that, your grandmother was a new mom, right?
Yes.
Your mom was her first kid, and then Dad's gone to war.
Exactly, to war, yeah.
And he was probably gone for a couple of years.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think back then when they went over, they stayed until it was done.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is it's hard to fathom.
Yeah.
Because it's tough to go anywhere like that for a few months, much less 2+ years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mom grew up here.
She grew up in Richmond, all 18 years through high school. She went to Maggie Walker High School. In fact, she was the valedictorian of Maggie Walker High School in 1960. Then she went to Fisk University, and she was there for 4 years, and she was a chemistry student, and she was very fortunate to be able to get a job at American Cynamid, which at the time had, I don't believe, any African-American chemists, much less an African-American female chemist.
Right.
And she was the first one hired, and that brought her to New Jersey. And from what she told me, all she did was work and go to church. And she met my father at the church, and my father had been in that area in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He actually taught for the Piscataway public schools. He had been there since the mid-1950s. He was originally from a town called Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And I believe him and several other friends moved to New Jersey after college because sort of that's where the jobs were at the time.
Right.
That area was growing. And that's how they met in the mid-1960s. And then I was born in 1969.
So your mom became the only black female chemist, only black chemist, and she's the daughter of an orphan who was a housekeeper. I mean,
Exactly.
That is a meteoric rise.
Yes. And my grandmother was an amazing woman. She, like I said, started working domestic work here in Richmond, as many African-American women of the time did. And then she moved on to do, I believe she did hairdressing and had a number of other jobs. But her primary job, and the job that I knew her in, that she worked in all the way up until the time that she passed away, was in the Richmond room in Thalheimer's. And I don't know if you remember years ago in Thalheimer's, they had this quite nice restaurant right in the middle of Thalheimer's. And that's where she worked. And she absolutely loved that job. It gave her a tremendous amount of independence. And, I think that she loved it, it had very, very nice surroundings. And, it was the kind of place where, sort of ladies would go for lunch. And she just loved the atmosphere, and everyone in Thalheimer's knew her and liked her. And she had that job all the way up until the time till she passed away. While I was here, I was a student here at St. Christopher's when she passed away in 1985. But she absolutely loved that job at Thalheimer's. And we would go at Christmas time and we would go shop at Thalheimer's and go to see her. And the one thing I remember that she would bring back to have at her house was that Thalheimer's is a rectangular chocolate layer cake. People from Richmond will remember this. Rectangular chocolate layer cake with 7 layers and a cherry right on top.
I remember.
And I think Ucrop started to sell them too. And the only place that I can't find it anywhere except there's a market around the corner right here from St. Christopher's called Libby Market that actually sells that cake. And every time I'm in Richmond, I get a slice of that cake.
Because it tastes so good, and it brings back fond memories for you. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's really cool. So you were 9 when you came here.
Yes.
Did you go to Henrico County Public Schools for a little bit?
I started at Chamberlain Elementary School, which is right in Chamberlain Farms. And then I went to Brookland Middle School for 2 years, which also in Henrico County, a little bit farther away from Chamberlain Farms. And
right there off Parham.
Off Parham, exactly. And I was there for 2 years. And then the way I ended up at St. Christopher's was I was not doing well in the public schools, just for a number of reasons. I was distracted, and I just, was unfocused, and just the environment wasn't working for me. And my mother had a friend whose son went to St. Christopher's, and it was suggested that I could go to the summer school here at St. Christopher's. And so that's what I did. I guess it must have been the summer of 1982.
Yep.
And, once I saw this campus and was exposed to the teachers for the summer, I'm like, I don't want to leave. And I went in and spoke to the head of the middle school at the time. I believe his name was Mr. Woodard.
That's right.
And just said, hey, I'm interested in going to St. Christopher's School. And he's like, well, you have to take a test. And this was, now there's an entire admission cycle, which, starts in January, and you have to plan if you want to go to the school or any school like this now in Richmond. But at the time, this was maybe August before school started, and I took a test, and next thing I know, I was enrolled and a student here at St. Christopher's, fall of 1982.
Yeah, that was the process for me, because you and I, we were talking earlier, we were 2 of 5 guys.
Yes.
4 of us graduated, and the 4 of us that graduated at the start of that year, it was you, me, Rich Reynolds, and Al Carter. And Al, we have to mention Al's full name. Is it Horace Alfonso Carter?
I believe so.
The 3rd or 4th?
Maybe the 4th.
I think he's the 4th.
Yeah.
And I got to know Al's mom pretty well. She taught forever at John Marshall.
She went to high school with my mother.
Oh, did they? They knew each other?
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, Lily was a great person. I'm sure I've met your mom, but I
yeah, at some point while we were here at school together.
Yeah. So it had to be kind of a culture shock coming here, a little bit coming from Henrico County Public Schools to a place like St. Christopher's. And by the way, your point about the campus, when you come here, you're like, this, it can't be this nice. It can't be this idyllic. It can't be this inviting.
Yeah.
But it was.
It is, yeah. And particularly the middle school, I always thought was quite a nice, charming building. It's just big enough that you don't feel overwhelmed by the building. And so I once, like I said, I liked the environment and I liked the teachers. I liked the focus that I was getting from the teachers. And I mean, I don't know if it was a huge culture shock because I'd had a mix of experiences. I had been, although I had gone to the Henrico County Public Schools, I had gone to elementary school in New Jersey, and then I'd gone to summer camp, a few other places. So I'd been around a lot of different types of kids even by that point. And so I was used to new environments. And I think the biggest shock was the academics because at least where I was in my particular middle school experience, I hadn't really been focusing as much. And of course here you had to focus immediately. I mean, the academics here were quite rigorous. So in things where I thought that I was pretty good, such as, English and stuff like that, it was a whole nother level. It's almost like I had to jump a whole year almost immediately when I came to school here.
Yeah, we had to adjust in a hot second because the standards were so much higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, and looking back, it was great for us. But going through that at the time, you're like, man.
And the amount of homework and but then again, I mean, there were other opportunities and experiences here extracurricularly that I don't know that I had really taken advantage of when I was in public school that I was able to take advantage of when I was here in St. Christopher's. I think, it was that initial sort of movement from public school to private school. And then again, I think also, and you may remember this, going from the middle school to the upper school was a bit of a transition as well.
Absolutely. Who were your teachers in 8th grade? Some of them. I don't remember all of mine, but I remember my favorites.
Mr. Ackerman, I believe. We had, were you in my history class with Fritz Kling?
I was.
And then I think I had an art class, Miss Barkstrom, and then...
Did you take Latin?
Yeah, well, I may have suppressed that from my mind. Yeah. Okay. Yes, we were in Mr. Blatton's Latin class, and I haven't suppressed it because the instruction was not great, which it was. It was absolutely excellent. But again, talk about something that shows the rigor of the St. Christopher's School. Mr. Blanton's Latin class was something else. And I had no exposure to Latin. I think I might have had some minor exposure to French, but all of that, the routine of practicing Latin and all of that type of stuff, that was very new to me. But I'm very glad I took that course.
Oh my gosh, his influence for me, ended up taking Latin in college. Mm-hmm. I love the language so much, and I also like the fact that you didn't have to speak it. But in his class, there was no screwing around.
Oh no, you wouldn't dare. And he was a really, I think back on the people that influenced me when I was here at St. Christopher's, and he was definitely one of them. Not so much in the classroom because I only had him as a teacher for 1 year, but we would, he at that time was setting up the weight room over in the gym, and we would come here. And I don't know if you may have shown up a couple of times. We would come here in the summer to train. And for me, particularly, I think definitely between 9th grade and 10th grade and 10th grade and 11th grade, it was something to do. Instead of getting into trouble, we would come here, we would go to the weight room. He made sure it was open for us every day during the summer, and we would just train. But it was great for me. I still weight train even at this age. But it was great to do. It taught me the value of a routine and doing something productive even when you really don't have anything else that you have to do. And, it was like, if you have downtime, just why not go and exercise, and weight training, I'm not a great athlete. I'm not even a good athlete, and I'm not very coordinated. But the one thing I am is I have a fair amount of strength. And so being able to weight train was something where it was a physical task that I was actually fairly good at. And it's something that, of course, I haven't kept up with it this entire time, but I would say more years than not in the past, 40 years, I've had some sort of weight training. And I think it's important. It can keep you healthy in certain ways. And I just really enjoy it. I still train every week with my trainer, try to do some weight training.
And as a kid, it instills some confidence in you too, right?
It does, yeah. It's like, well, I might not be the best athlete, but, I can lift 300 pounds, so that's something.
Well, and look, you and I, when we were in school here, I don't think we appreciated how prolific Bob Blanton was as a weightlifter and what he had learned as a weightlifter. Yeah. And it was pretty rare back then because weightlifting was a thing you did, but it's not as scientific and as protocoled as it is today. But he was an alternate on the 72 Berlin Olympic
I remember
team.
that, yeah.
And the 76 Montreal team. He was an alternate, which, he unfortunately didn't get to compete, but he was that good. He was still elite.
Yep.
Which it's hard to fathom.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I have great memories of Bob Blanton, especially after I got over the fear of being in that 8th grade Latin class. All right, so, the jump to high school, the thing for me, and I'm curious whether you felt this, we had an hour and a half or 2 hours of homework in 8th grade.
Yep.
I feel like it doubled by the time we were in 9th grade.
I think there was the consistency of it, that you knew you were going to have an hour and a half of homework every single night. For me, that's what I remember. And I recall that I had a tremendous amount of reading that I had to do, which I don't know that I had in my prior educational experience. And so, that really made an impression. Having to read an hour every single night, just to keep up with what was going on.
And over the summer, we were reading. When I got the reading list, I said, "What is this?
Yeah,
I'm supposed to have fun this summer, not read."
Yeah,
but I'm better off.
Oh, I was glad I read all of those books. And, for me, I actually do like to read. But what was great about the summer reading was that, when I got to college, there was a lot of discussion about, have you read what's called the Western canon? Which there's a lot of debate around, whether this one set of books should be the books that everyone has read. Because, the one thing about the Western canon was, although these were great books, there wasn't a lot of diversity in them, at least until recently. Now, I think they've added some books here and there. But the great thing was, when I had gotten to college, I'm like, I've already read most of these books, because we had that summer reading assignment. And so I was very glad to have done that, and I think there's a value to being well read, meaning that you have read a lot of the various classics, and when someone makes that reference to Shakespeare or to the great authors Steinbeck, okay, it's like, well, I've read that, or I've at least read something that he's written, or he or she has written, and so I think there's a value there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we read roughly 5 books every summer.
Yeah, it was 4 or 5 books. You had to put in. You couldn't go a week without reading if you wanted to keep up with the assignment.
Yeah, you couldn't cram the last couple of weeks.
Yep.
That's for sure. All right, your fondest memories from high school here?
That's an interesting question.
Or maybe not so fond.
Yeah, I think it was a mix. I remember it as a time when I had to work very hard, and when I was extremely goal oriented, and those goals, they didn't come easy. I had to work to get to where I wanted to go. But at the same time, there was a great camaraderie here that, I still recall among the people that we went to school with. And, there'd be a lot of good-natured ribbing, sometimes not so good-natured ribbing. But in the end, it was still, we were all trying to get through this experience. And I think we recognized that this was an important time that would be valuable to us in the future. And, I think our class was great in that we sort of were a group where more or less, everyone more or less sort of got along.
Yeah.
And there was a very strong camaraderie. And, I think when I remember, I was just in the chapel service this morning, and that's the one space that really, it hasn't changed in the 40 years since we were here. And that space, I remember distinctly being there, hearing the chapel speeches, and just having that time to think and to reflect. I think is a very important part of the high school experience for me, and I'm glad that we did that. And also various moments in the classroom, certain lectures. I still have strong memories of thinking, oh yeah, well, I never thought about something that way. And I think that one of the greatest things about my experience here was that there was sort of an intellectual awakening here for me that I would then continue to build on as I went through college and through law school. And that to me was one of the most valuable parts of it. That and the discipline that came through both the hard academic work and the discipline that came through the athletics. Although I was never a good athlete, the fact that I knew that I had to participate every day, and I was never going to be that successful in it. I was never going to have any athletic glory, but I knew I had to do it. It prepared me for times in my life in the future when there would be difficult things that I knew I would have to do that I didn't want to do, but I'm like, okay, well, I got to do them. And so that had a huge, huge value for me.
Yeah, it was mind, body, soul sort of
Exactly.
approach here, which they were very serious about. And when you mentioned chapel, I grew to adore being at chapel, especially my junior and senior years. I think we had all matured, certainly more mature than we were when we were in ninth grade. Yeah. And I remember some of the speakers that came through. I mean, we were so lucky.
Yes.
Unbelievably lucky.
Yeah.
And I cherish those.
Yep.
Yeah. So in fact, I had one that touched me. I remember it today, and I use it in my life today, which is kind of crazy to think about since it was so long ago. Cool. All right. So you ended up going to an Ivy League school.
Dartmouth College. Yes.
Yeah. Did you end up? Did you want to go Ivy League? Was that something you really strived for, or did it just
sort of happened very quickly? So we went into senior year, and at that time, I had the expectation that I would stay in state to go to school. I had some cousins. I had a cousin that went to Tufts University, and I had gone to his graduation recently. And I'm like, oh, well, Tufts might be an interesting place to go to school because I really like Boston. But I didn't, you Tufts, you have Harvard, you have BU. I didn't think that there was no way I would ever, get into Harvard. But I had an uncle that had gone to Dartmouth College in the 50s, actually. And somehow his fraternity panel, which had Dartmouth written on the side of it, ended up in my possession. And so I always had that name sort of stuck in my head. Huh. And the idea of going to school in northern New England in a rural environment sort of, for some reason, always appealed to me. I always liked that part of the country. I don't know if you've ever been up to northern New England, but the hills and the mountains and the fresh air. And so when we entered senior year here, I was just like, okay, well, let me pick 4 schools. And I knew I wanted to apply to Virginia and William and Mary, and actually thought most likely I would go to one of those 2 schools. And I did apply to Tufts because I was interested in going to school potentially in Boston. And then I just added on Dartmouth as a reach.
Kind of a flyer.
Yeah, like a flyer. And, I really focused on preparing, back then, now they have the common application. We didn't have the common application.
No, we did not.
And you had to really focus on putting together your application. And again, where I had the benefit of St. Christopher's and all that meticulous work, particularly Ron Smith's English class.
A lot of writing.
A lot of writing. And I remember really, really focusing on my college essays and putting hours and hours into them, but also making sure that they looked really good. I remember choosing like the color of the paper, because back then it was like a paper application that you put together. And this would become a part of my thing all the way through my career, even looking for jobs at law firms. I always paid meticulous attention to the way my resume would look and the way I presented myself sort of on paper. And so the last thing, which ended up being the thing that got me into Dartmouth College was I had videotapes of my Battle of the Brains competitions.
I'd forgotten you were.
So I was on the Battle of the Brains team, which was on the local PBS channel. And the one thing, and I'm still quite good at history trivia. So, I answering all these questions on TV related primarily to history, culture, that was sort of my thing. And I said, last minute, again, it was a different college admissions environment where you could just throw everything on top of your application. But I took the videotape and just stuck it in the application envelope. And when I got to know the admissions officer later when I actually was at Dartmouth, she's like, that was it. That's what got you in. She's like, my kids were watching that video. And I was like, she was like, oh, where is this? Oh, Richmond, Virginia, St. Christopher's School. That's what got me on the list.
That's great.
So
that's awesome.
Yeah,
who would have thought?
Yeah, and if anyone from Dartmouth is listening to this, it certainly wasn't the only thing that got me into college, I would hope, but it was part of it. It's what made me sort of stick out and become a little bit unique. And so, that's how I ended up. And then once I got in, I think I remember having a conversation with my mother, and I'd gotten into all 4 schools, and she's like, well, if you got into Dartmouth, just go to Dartmouth. I'm like, yeah, I agree. And that's what I did.
Seems like a no-brainer.
Yes.
Yeah. Who were your teammates on Battle of the Brains? Do you remember?
Wesley Wright.
Okay.
Bill Lamb. It was 2 years. So 1 year I was an alternate.
Okay. And
the second year I was actually on the TV team.
Right.
So Emery Elmore and Kinlo Nelson.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Were you the only one from our class besides Bill?
Yes.
Okay.
Bill was our captain.
You and Bill?
Yeah.
All right. Nice. Did you vote for the captain?
I don't know that we voted. There were only 4 of us. So
yeah, it's been a weird vote.
Yeah. And we did fairly well. We lost to Lee Davis, actually.
Huh.
In either the quarter or the semifinals.
Yeah, you guys didn't see that coming.
No.
Yeah.
Well, they were pretty good.
They obviously were pretty good.
Yeah. It was, and for several years we had won the Battle of the Brains championship. I don't know if we had won it the year before, but we had definitely won it for several years. So we were sort of one of the star teams, but that particular year we came up a little bit short. But I loved it. I still do trivia to this day.
It's fun.
I still do like bar trivia. I enjoy it.
That's a lot of fun. All right, before we leave your high school days, name a couple of your favorite teachers.
Well, I would have to say Ron Smith and, of course, David Boney. Who could forget him?
Our entire class took his European history class. It was all 70 of us.
Yeah. And Lee Camp, all excellent teachers.
I think she may have been the only female teacher.
She was at the time.
Yeah.
And ones that I still remember, Andy Smith, of course. And even in areas where I wasn't that strong, mathematics, Jim Boyd.
Jim Boyd was fascinating.
Cal Boyd. I can't say, I don't know that I ever had a poor teacher here. They were all excellent.
We didn't have bad teachers.
Yeah.
We had excellent teachers. That's right. Yeah. Very fortunate that we had all excellent teachers.
Yes.
All right, so you're at Dartmouth. Was it a big transition for you?
Well, it was the transition of going from Richmond, which was, I felt, when you're in Richmond, at least at that time, it was very much, about Virginia and the locality. And all of a sudden, you're in this environment with people from all over the country. So you're just someone from somewhere else. It's like everyone's from all these different places, and you're not necessarily from one of the big fancy cities. You're not from New York. You're not from LA. You're not from Chicago. So there was a little bit of that transition, but I sort of enjoyed it. I enjoyed meeting all the different types of people from all over the country. And, everyone had a little bit of their different perspective. And the great thing was you had people from all over. I would probably say there weren't as many international students as you would have in an Ivy League school now, but you definitely had people from all over the United States. So of course, there was more representation from the Northeast, as you would imagine, but generally it was people from all over the place. And so I just sort of was the kind of guy that was going around shaking everyone's hands and meeting everybody. And that resulted in me becoming vice president of my class freshman year. And one of the activities that I would pursue at Dartmouth was student government. So I held a number of student government roles, and that was one of my activities. Academically, it was a bit of a transition. Again, St. Christopher's prepared me well enough to avoid the areas where I was weak. So I was definitely weak in math, but St. Christopher to train me well enough so that I was able to test out of math. But I did have a core curriculum at Dartmouth. You had to take 4 sciences, you had to take 4 social sciences, and you had to take 4 humanities. The social sciences and the humanities were easy for me, but the sciences were a little bit more difficult. And I do remember I had to have a little bit of an academic adjustment. I took geology my first year, and sort of had to struggle to keep up with that. So it was, that it was a little bit of an adjustment, but I actually took very well to college life. There were some people that, I think had to adjust to sort of being on their own. And even for me, I think I'd been well prepared enough that that wasn't a huge struggle for me. I knew enough, okay, I had to go and do my work and do my, you don't really have homework in college, but go to class and do what you need to do. And, I would not skip class. I remember seeing, and generally at a school like that, people don't skip classes, but some people did. But, for me, particularly when I got into the academic areas, which I really loved, such as history and religion, I would never miss a class because the lectures to me were absolutely fascinating. The professors were tremendous. And, just the intellectual experience of, being in one of these history classes or religion classes, and for me it was a great experience. That's where I learned to enjoy and love learning. And I did some fun stuff at Dartmouth too. I was in the fraternity and everything. But still, I really, for me, what sticks out about that experience was the quality of the education. And just sort of the discussions that we would have even outside of the classroom, like, the intellectual discussions. I really enjoyed that as well.
Sort of a always-on vibe there, I'm guessing.
Yeah, although not as much as you think, but a little bit. Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of that. I mean, the one thing was you had such a talented pool of students, and, you get into a conversation with someone, and even at that young age, some of the insights that they would come up with would really be like, wow, it's like, I never looked at it that way. And if there were any skills that I honed there, it was more conversational skills and, how to approach sort of learning, and then also independent study, because I pursued, particularly in history, a lot of independent study. I did a semester at the London School of Economics in 1989, and a large part of that was independent study. So for me, having to learn how to do the research, particularly in history, learning how to collect primary research, organize it, build that into a thesis and putting that on paper and expressing that in a cogent, clear way that people could understand it. I think that was, for me, the greatest value of the college experience.
Did you enjoy Tony Simondera as an English teacher?
Oh, yes. The best teacher one of the best teachers I've ever had.
We're at Alumni Hall here at St. Christopher's, and I told Tony you and I were doing this today, or at least I told him I was here. And Tony is in here, so I'm going to pause real quickly. Yep. All right, we had a nice little break chatting with Tony Simondera there off recording, and I believe we were talking about your experiences at Dartmouth. You majored in history.
I did major in history, and again, that was always my strongest subject in high school and in college. And as part of the history program there, I did a semester at the London School of Economics in 1989.
That's cool.
And I really have always had a strong interest in European history, and in particular British history. So it was an opportunity for me to really focus on that. And as part of that program, we would go on tours of all the various castles and palaces, the Palace of Westminster and government buildings. So a part of that course is also a history of London. So I have a great understanding of London and all of its history. And I was just there actually in September. And it's always great to go visit these places that you've learned a tremendous amount about. It sort of gives you another dimension to your travel there, because you're like, okay, I know what that building was and what happened here and all of that type of stuff. But for me, studying history was it was great. And we had a very strong history faculty at Dartmouth. And it's almost like for fun for me, sometimes I'll just sit down on Wikipedia and start reading different historical facts and stuff like that. I find it interesting, fascinating.
What part of London is super fascinating, or what geographical spot on the map is most intriguing and enjoyable?
I lived in an area called Bayswater, which is right near Paddington Station, and not too far away from Hyde Park. And Hyde Park is one of the world's great parks. Almost like saying Central Park and other things. But you can walk from Hyde Park past Buckingham Palace through St. James Park by St. James Palace. It's just over the years the British had built this tremendous complex of just majestic buildings and parks, and that's almost unlike anything else in the world. So I think that particular area. And of course, I like actually men's fashion. So you'll often find me, if I'm in London, in St. James Square, in that area, which has a lot of the best men's shops, particularly shirts. And it's the one item of clothing I try to save up for to get made in London. So I have quite a few London shirts, and that's like sort of my guilty pleasure, to go get a tailor-made shirt made for me in London.
You are much better dressed today than I am, and I imagine that's true every day of the year.
Sometimes I can be, particularly, of course, during the pandemic, as we all were, I gained a very large collection of sweatpants and everything as I was working from home. But, working in New York, it's a bit of a fashion town, so I sort of picked it up. And then when I was for 10 years, I did international work. It's sort of skipping ahead a bit. But when I was an in-house lawyer for Merck, and I had to go to Italy quite a bit. And I would say until then, I was probably your standard off-the-rack dresser. I'd probably go to Brooks Brothers and get your basic suit and tie. But I had to go to Italy in a short period in just a few years. I had to go to Italy like 20 times. And these guys, I would sit in business meetings in Rome, and I noticed how these guys were impeccably dressed. I mean, everyone had just tremendous style in Rome. And that sort of got into my head, and I was like, sort of looking at the way they dressed and how they all put it together. And I think I picked up some of those things. So I'm like, okay, well, now I know I can wear this type of tie with that type of shirt. And then ever since then, I've been sort of a bit of a fashion type guy. But that was sort of the turning point, going to Europe and seeing not just Italy. Well, Italy, I think, is probably, and I might get in trouble for this, the best dressed country in the world. But
it's in their culture.
Yeah, France, London, particularly in European business culture, people pay a lot of attention to how they dress. And so when I was going to meetings there and in negotiations, I started to pay more attention to how I dress. And so I've sort of kept up with that over the years. So I think that.
And you enjoy it.
Oh yeah, it's sort of like a bit of a hobby, sort of, okay, this fabric, how does that look? And I think that the two habits I picked up from all my European travels was the dressing, and then also good wine. Because again, I was going out to dinner in London and Paris and Rome, not so much London, but Paris and Rome. And before that, sort of all wine sort of tasted the same to me. But then, you go out to dinner in Rome 20 times, and you have someone from Rome ordering really good Italian wines over and over again. You're like, okay, that one's better than this one, and this one's better than that one. And you start to learn, and you begin to develop like a real wine palate. And so that got me into my hobby of buying wine. And so I like to take wine trips when I can afford it. So I don't do it every year, but I love to go to California and take 2 or 3 days and visit different wineries and sort of buy some wines and store them. And I like to share them with friends. Every year at home in New Jersey, I do a wine tasting for a group of about 12 or 11 friends. And again, it's just a hobby that I enjoy.
Yeah. You have a wine cellar?
I don't have a room for a wine cellar, but I have off-site storage. for my several hundred bottles.
Yeah,
of
I mean,
wine.
it's a real hobby.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I still don't have a palate for wine. I never have.
Yeah, it takes a while to pick it up, but once you've tasted a few hundred wines, you'll start to make the distinctions between the various.
And really good ones, too.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so back to Dartmouth. Did you know that you were going to be a lawyer when you were a kid, or what?
That was always my goal. I mean, I was always strongest in, reading and writing, and I was never very good at math. So all the sciences and those disciplines I knew I was going to be that good at. And even just finance, I just didn't have the mathematical mind for it. But being a lawyer was something that I thought that would be interesting. And yes, I mean, if you had caught me when I was a senior in high school and asked me, what do I think I wanted to be, it was going to be a lawyer. And pretty much everyone that went to school with me at Dartmouth would know me as someone who said, okay, I'm on my way to law school, or I'm going to apply to law school right after this. I might have had a little bit of an interest in investment banking, but more or less I was, there was the idea that I was going to go to law school.
When did you know what kind of lawyer you wanted to be?
Well, that happened much later. I mean, and I don't know that I really made a conscious decision. It had to do with the opportunities that I got. So I graduated from college in 1991, and I started at UVA Law in the fall of 1991. And, there was a bit of a recession going on then. And the first job I got was with a New York law firm called Brown and Wood, which specialized in securities law. So that sort of made the choice for me that I would become a corporate lawyer. I could have been a litigator, but for whatever reason, the corporate side just sort of appealed to me. I liked and this wouldn't come until later on in my legal career, but the negotiation aspect of it. And again, as I was talking about before, the idea of meticulousness and documentation, which is a large part of corporate law, putting together and comprising and putting together documentation, whether it's a prospectus or other things like that. So the documentation aspect of it appealed to me. Also, the fact that it was sort of a little bit faster paced, meaning that you had a deal which might run a few weeks or a month, and then you got that deal done. Whereas, legal cases can go on for years, litigation cases. So I like the fact, okay, I'm getting things done. I'm getting this deal done. I'm getting that deal done. Move on to the next deal. Sort of the pace of it. And I also like the fact that it wasn't as local. Litigation tends to be, and this is not entirely the case, but, a little bit more locally focused, whereas corporate law can take you almost anywhere in the world. And it did with me, as I mentioned. I did a lot of work in Europe, the Middle East, some work in Africa. So being in corporate law has, sort of exposed me to a lot of different things.
It sounds like you've been to 6 continents.
Pretty much. I'm trying to think of where I haven't been.
I'm guessing you haven't been to Antarctica. That's the only continent.
Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, I've been to most places. There are a few places, like I didn't go to Asia for the first time until I was in my 40s. So there are a few places, but I mean places like Europe, and I've been to Latin America. Europe I've been to over and over and over again. I've been to South Africa, Egypt, Morocco. But the first taste of international living I got was when I was here at St. Christopher's. I don't know if you remember that I was an exchange student to Israel, an AFS exchange student.
I don't remember that. What year in school?
That was in between junior and senior year. When we finished here junior year, about a week or two after that, I got on a plane. I went to Israel. I was there for 8 weeks.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
You had to feel like you were on a different planet, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. Back then, particularly without the internet and cell phones, I mean, it was completely different environment. And it was fascinating. But for me, it was like a tremendous experience. It was mind-opening for me to go to Israel, which was, a completely different country. Culturally and just in a number of different ways. But also, I mean, tremendous history there, of course, to go to Jerusalem. I lived outside of Tel Aviv, but just to live in another country and see the daily experience of living in another country at that age it lets you realize that, okay, the whole world's not like where you come from. And so you need to be open to very different experiences and different ways of living, and that other people, have very different lifestyles and cultures that they come from. And it allows you to understand that people have different cultural perspectives, and to weave that into what you're doing when you're dealing with them, whether that be in business or any other, sort of experience. So years later, when I was doing mostly international legal work, I think that early experience of living completely immersed in a different culture helped me to understand some of these extremely different cultures that I was going into, with different styles of communication and a different approach to business, and a very different way in some ways of looking at the world, and being able to sort of, instead of imposing your own perspective on those individuals, understanding a little bit better what their perspective is.
And then when you do offer a perspective, it's now informed, or at least better informed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Israel, the history of that part of the world goes back thousands of years.
Yep.
But the country, when you went there, had been around just under 40 years.
Yes, it was still a very new country, and still not that far away, maybe 10 or 15 years away from the wars that they had in the 1970s. And you definitely you felt the impact of that in the fact that they still had to maintain a very active military at all times, and you would get on a bus and you would see guys with machine guns, and that was my first experience with a high security environment, because they still had to worry about terrorism and bombs and things of that nature. But yeah, it was you're a fairly new country, and most of the people that had moved there had only been there for one or two generations.
Yeah.
So it was, but it was a fascinating experience. I really enjoyed it. I had a good time there and met a lot of good friends. Unfortunately, I didn't learn that much Hebrew, but I still look at it as one of the most great adventures of my youth.
Yeah, you learn things that your classmates couldn't dream of.
Yeah, because you can't really learn some of the stuff in a classroom. You have to see it. And it left me open to different experiences insofar as, eating food, and just realizing, that you're going to be presented with things that are very different from your own home experience, and you need to be open to that instead of just saying, okay, I'm not going to eat that, or I'm not going to go there, or I'm not going to, you learn that if you really want to experience some of these cultures, that you need to open yourself up to these experiences and be more of a little bit of a, I guess, sort of go with the flow to a certain degree.
Let's go back to law school. Was UVA part of your choice? They have a great reputation, but it's also kind of brought you home too.
Yeah, exactly. Coming from Virginia and being an in-state student, I knew that Virginia was definitely going to be in the mix. I thought a little bit, maybe it'd be nice to go to Harvard Law. I think I looked at Georgetown and Yale, but it wasn't like I applied to like 20 law schools. Either I get into Yale or Harvard, or I go to Virginia, and that's pretty much what I ended up doing. And Virginia, again, great law school, one of the best in the country. So I certainly was very happy with that choice. And once I got there, I was really happy with that choice, because Virginia, at least at my time there, as a law school, has a very unique culture where we, really the students sort of cooperated with each other. You have the softball culture, which is very strong at UVA, and a very important part of first year. But then what you also had was, and I don't know if I'm giving out a University of Virginia Law School secret, I certainly can't be the first to talk about this, but maybe I am. So, law school can be very competitive, and certainly as when I went to Wall Street and met people that had gone to other law schools, they're like, oh yeah, people are ripping pages out of textbooks and stuff like that. But we never had that at UVA. And we had sort of the first year, you take a certain set of core courses, and those you sort of do on your own, but then second and third year are sort of electives. And what we would do at UVA, and again, I hope I'm not giving out a UVA law secret, was, at least at this time in the 1990s, was your first day of class, you get this sign-up sheet, and it would be, 13 weeks semester or whatever. You'd have 1 to 13, and you'd sign your name next to one of those numbers, and that would be the week that you were responsible for. So what you knew was that you had to go to class for that entire week, and you had to do all the assigned reading.
You had to nail it
for that week, and you definitely had to nail it. You had to. So you could go the other weeks, but that week was. And I would say I didn't use that as an opportunity to skip class. I would go to most classes, but your particular week you had to know backwards and forwards, up and down, 100%. And what you would do is you would prepare this very meticulous outline with summary of lectures, summary of cases, all the major points. And it would be like a 10 or 13 page paper once you got done with it. And what we do is we'd go around in our mailboxes and we would drop off, I would have that outline list, and I would drop off my week's outline to all those individuals. And they would do the same for me. So at the end, I would have this huge, thick outline, and that would be basically my study guide. And preparing for exams was just working through that thing over and over and over again. And if you did that, you had a pretty good understanding of the coursework. Now, again, to my knowledge, nothing that was in any way violated any honor code or anything. No, it's just a way of organizing.
It's just a different approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't think of any other law school where the students were so, and this is not just one or two classes. This is almost every class where the students were in such cooperation with each other, that we would be willing to do that. And one of the reasons is that one of the great things about UVA as a top law school is that we were all going to different places. So, NYU, Columbia, both great schools, but a lot of those people were, dead set on working in New York. But the great thing about UVA is that you had a group that wanted to go work in New York, and you had a group that wanted to go work in DC and become Capitol Hill type people, and you had a group that wanted to go back home to Kentucky or Tennessee or wherever they were from in the South, and you had a group that wanted to go to California. So we had a very diverse group of people that were interested in going different places. So it wasn't like, oh, okay, if that person, is, 10 points ahead of me in the class, they're going to take my, this big fancy Wall Street job that I want. We were all going different places. But for me, as a law school experience, I was very glad that that's the law school that I chose. And like I said, the great thing was I've been fortunate in that all the schools I went to, from St. Christopher's to Dartmouth to UVA Law, were places that prized camaraderie and being part of a group and sort of a culture of community. And so for me, all three of those schools, I felt that I was like a part of a community that was in many ways supportive. So, looking back on it, I think I made three, excellent choices. And of course, from time to time, I gripe about this aspect or that aspect of one of the schools.
Nothing's perfect.
But in the end, I can't say that I had, in the end, I think it worked out great for me. There's three schools that I chose.
I have a UVA law educated guest on a few weeks ago who shared your 13-week
okay.
knowledge.
So I'm not the first.
So you're not the first to share on a recording.
Yeah.
But he also described to me how UVA was not focused, and this was a little surprising to me, was not focused on helping people pass the Virginia bar or the New York bar. It was more of a national feel, and so you could go to any state in the union and succeed, but it wasn't necessarily going to set you up to do well for taking a specific bar.
No, because people were going, all over the place. And then you had to take another course. And that was the summer of 1994 when I stayed in Charlottesville to study the bar. There's a special course called Barbary, and that prepares you for the bar. The one thing that sticks out about that time was that earlier in the summer, actually we had gone to our first course, and I come home and the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase was on.
June of 94.
Yeah, that was that time period. So that's what I remember about, sort of studying for the bar. But I studied for the bar and then went up to Albany and took the bar and got it.
You took the New York bar.
I had to take the New York bar, because I had a job in New York City. And that was, I got it on the first try, so that was lucky for me because I didn't want to have to take that exam again.
And the New York bar is the only one you took. You didn't think about taking Virginia?
No, I only took it. I only took the New York bar. Yeah,
because you were pretty confident you were going to live and work in that area.
Yeah, I didn't think I was going to go, anywhere else. So, the New York bar was enough for me.
How were you notified that you passed?
So back then, again, sort of pre-internet, although we did have email at that time, but I don't think the internet was. Nowadays, you know the results come through the internet. But what would happen was all the first-year associates in New York law firms, were completely focused on when the bar results were coming out. And it was sort of like college admissions, except it may have been the reverse. In college admissions, you see the fat envelope, you got in. The small envelope, you didn't get in because fat envelope has all the stuff for you to sign up. I think it's the reverse for the bar. If the fat envelope means you failed it and you're going to have to reapply to take the bar. The thin envelope is just a one message thing saying you've got in to you passed the bar. So what happened was I was living in a building called Tribeca Tower, which was not too far away from the World Trade Center, which is where I worked. And
you worked in one of the towers.
Yeah, I worked in Tower Number 1, 57th floor. And so what happened was some guy got a call from some guy at some firm in Midtown that, the bar results were out. And so they were showing up everywhere. And I call, anyone who knows a little bit about the geography of New York will know next to the World Trade Center, you have the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Postal Station, which was my postal station because I just lived a few blocks away. So I called over. I was so, sort of focused on this. I called over to the post office and got a very friendly guy. And I was like, hey, have you done your delivery to, Duane Street yet? He's like, no, I'm about to go do it. And he's like, I'm like, do you have anything, from that looks official? It's like, yeah, there's a bunch of official stuff here. And I'm like, when are you going up there? He's like, well, I'm going up there in the next, 30, 40 minutes. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go up there. So I went up to my building to wait for the bar results. And then the guy shows up with the mail. And then as soon as I saw that thin envelope, I'm like, all right. I passed the bar, thank goodness.
And the thicker envelope was because the actual paper application was in there?
Yeah, because they're like, you failed the bar, now you need to apply for the next one. So, the next seating of the test. So I still remember that experience. But, it was like, as you can imagine, and lawyers are sort of, a little bit geeky, but we were all sort of focused on, when the bar results were coming out. And so it was great to sort of get past that, so not have to worry about the...
That's a massive milestone. Yeah. Were you living in New York during 9/11?
I was. Now that's an interesting story because I was in some ways very close to what happened, but then not. So by 2001, I'd finished my time at law firms. I worked for 2 different law firms in New York as a corporate and securities lawyer, and I did some mergers and acquisitions work. And then in 1998, I joined Merck & Company as their junior M&A and corporate lawyer. And then, so 2001, I was still in that job, but I still lived in Manhattan. And every morning I would get up. I parked in Tribeca, which is near where I lived, and then I would drive through the tunnel. And I was supposed to be at work at 8:30 every morning, but, sometimes I'd be, early or late. And I think that morning we actually had primary elections in New York. And my voting precinct was, and those who are listening that know some of the geography of New York, my voting precinct was right behind the Tweed Courthouse, which is right next to City Hall. Now, from City Hall, you get a very clear view of the World Trade Center. So I remember I'm like, okay, let me get up early early. So it was well before 8 o'clock, which is when I believe things started to happen. And I said, let me get up early and go vote. But the one distinct memory of that morning is going to vote and looking out to my right over City Hall Park. And it was a beautiful day, clear as a bell, and seeing the Twin Towers, which, of course, I had no idea that would be the last time I'd ever see them live. And I got in the car and I was driving along and listening to the radio. And I would say probably about 10 minutes outside of the tunnel, that's when, I started to hear about it. And I drove, I immediately got to work and no one was working. Everyone was huddled around TV sets. And I talked to people. I had a girlfriend at the time and I talked to her. She was in Manhattan. I talked to another buddy. And then all of a sudden, all cell phone communications with Manhattan went out completely. So I couldn't talk to anyone back in New York. And, I just got a hotel room out in New Jersey where I was working. And then the next day, I knew I couldn't drive into the city. So I just got on a train and had to go all the way around Manhattan. So I had to go through Staten Island through to Brooklyn. And I wasn't able to get back home. Well, here's the interesting thing. The second day, they were allowed people to go down that lived in the area to go down to that area. And I do recall seeing a lot of things. I mean, there are a lot of troops and everything, but pictures that I've never seen published, but they had a huge military presence down there the day after it happened. And the police, I had to go through several police checkpoints. And they said, okay, do you live down here? And they're like, okay, you're going to be able to go in, and you're going to get your stuff, and you're going to leave. And we'll tell you when you can come back. And I lived on the 17th floor of the building, and all the power was out. And I remember having to go, run up to my apartment, throw a few things in a bag, run back, and then I had to live at my girlfriend's place for the rest of the week. And then finally, I don't know how they told us, but they're like, okay, residents of this area can come back. And the whole area was it was devastating. It was just, there was not only the human tragedy, which was, tremendous, of course, but also the physical damage that had been done to that part of the city, which was my part of the city. Several buildings were completely destroyed, and then a lot of buildings sort of around it were also devastated. And there was so much debris and rubbish, and you never knew, how is this area ever gonna come back from this? A whole section of the city had been destroyed. But I tell you, one of the most fascinating things over the 13 or 14 years after that was to see that part of the city over time recover and rebuild and to come back to be even, in some ways stronger than it was before. But, I remember the years for a while there was just a big empty space, and the train would sort of come into this big sort of empty, just void of, because they were building all those buildings. And, now, you have the excellent memorial, which was actually designed by a Dartmouth classmate of mine. The new World Trade Center and the beautiful new train station. Of course, you never forget the terrible tragedy of it and sort of all the lives that were lost, which was just devastating, to the community, because, I knew people that were involved. I knew guys, a firefighter. I knew people that worked in those buildings. Even remembering that, just to see a city like New York rebuild itself was just an amazing thing to witness over the course of many, many years. But that being said, I don't think anyone that experienced that. And like I said, I wasn't right there, but I definitely was experienced part of what was going on. I don't think you'd ever forget it because, it was just completely, out of the blue. It just, one day is a normal day and then, something like that happens.
There's no way you could anticipate that. And I won't get into the conspiracy theories around what the U.S. government knew and all that. Yeah. I will say, as a guy who was living in Central Virginia when that happened, it was, even though the events were horrific, it did bring the country together for a period of time.
It did, and it really brought New York together. I would say, I moved to New York in '94, and I had issues with New York. I mean, everyone does that moves to New York. I mean, no one comes to New York and, it's the greatest place in the world, I love it. Because this city is rough on you. New York is tough. It can be tough on people. It's particularly tough on young people. But what I will say is that experience, when that happened, I'm like, they attacked not just the city that I moved to, they attacked my city. And ever since then, although I'm proud to have been from Virginia, there's no question about it. And although I do live in New Jersey now, really, I'm a New Yorker. And ever since that moment, I've been in New York. I'm very proud to be, and that's my city. There's a lot that you can say about it, but I love New York.
I love visiting New York. I don't know how people get there.
It can be tough. It can be tough. If you're not from there, there's an adjustment period.
Yeah, I mean, I've been up there probably 10 times, and I've been pushed out of the way every time I go up there.
Yeah. It has its difficulty, but to me, it has, there is really no place like it. And like I said, I've been a lot of different places in the world. There's no place like it in the world. And it is, at the same time, it can be frustrating, but incredibly charming, and you will see almost every slice of life that you can think of walking around the different parts of New York. And it is really in many ways the center. Your podcast entitled "Center of the Universe," but I see New York as the center of the world.
Yeah, no, I get it. When you travel, and you've traveled extensively, mm-hmm. If you could go somewhere for a couple weeks, 6 weeks, where's that one place you want to go to that's not New Jersey or New York or Virginia?
There are places that I really like. I like California. I love the weather and the scenery. Europe, of course. I mean, I love the culture and the food and the refinement. I think it would depend sort of for me what type of mood that I was in. If I want to enjoy food and culture, Europe's the place, right? If I want to enjoy wine and good weather, I'm off to California. If I'm just looking to relax in the sun on a beach, then I'm probably off to the Dominican Republic. So it depends on what particular, I've been a lot of very fascinating places. And, someone asked me earlier today when I told them that I'd been to a lot of different countries, which one is your favorite? I said, I can't pick a favorite. I can pick maybe 5 or 6 that I really like, but I can't pick like one that's like, okay, I definitely would go there and stay there for long periods of time. There are several. They all have different attributes,
Any of those places you would think about living, maybe in retirement?
Part of my recent travels have been checking out different places for potential retirement possibilities. So I went to the Dominican Republic for 2 weeks in the winter just to get out of the cold. And I'm like, I like it here, but I don't like the fact that I can't drink the water. And then I went down to Colombia for 2 weeks. I'm like, this is great, but a great country, wonderful people. But, the part of Colombia I was in might be a little bit dangerous. So, I'm still sort of testing different places out. And the problem is I like the seasons, so I don't know that I want to live in a warm climate the entire time. Like, I really like New England, but I don't know that I really like the winters there, right? And again, I really like places like Latin America, but, during the summer, I don't know if I could live there, or during the wet season. So, I don't know. I might have to move around from point to point when I retire. We'll see.
Yeah, Belize. If you've never been to Belize, you can check that out.
It's on my list.
Yeah, it's definitely that would be warm most of the year. You would have a rainy season, but when it's not raining and it's not brutally hot, it's a great place to be. Mm-hmm. You're at St. Christopher's today for 2 or 3 reasons. Can you share what you were doing today?
So, about 2 years ago, I guess almost 3 years ago, 2020, we created a Black alumni network. And this is something that actually quite a few, almost all colleges have sort of Black alumni associations. And many private schools are now starting to form Black alumni networks. The idea is it allows Black alumni and current Black students to sort of keep in touch with each other, because what we found at a lot of these schools was that people sort of didn't know any other African Americans that, except for the ones that they were in school with, that had gone to the school. And so we had a series of phone calls where we got students or alumni from all over the country to come together and talk about their experiences. And as a result of that, the idea was that we would form a network, which would meet from time to time and try to do things to both, support recent alumni and support all students here at the school. And as the first thing that the school did was, unfortunately, the very first African American graduate of the school had died recently, I believe in 2021. And so we decided that we would have a chapel service to commemorate his life. And I was asked to speak at that chapel service, and I spoke.
That's why you and I are talking right now, because
Exactly.
Tim McCoy heard that. He said you were amazing that day.
Thank you. And then as part of that, we had, if you go to the front of this building, you will see a monument dedicated to Mr. Walter Lindsay, who was class of 1975 and the first African-American graduate of St. Christopher's. So we dedicated that monument, and then we, later in the day, had a networking session with current students, allowing them to ask questions of us about our life and careers. And so this is the second annual iteration of that event. And this year, again, unfortunately, we lost one of our very prominent graduates, Congressman Donald McEachin, who was elected to 4 terms in Congress. And he was a graduate of St. Christopher's class of 1979, a very prominent attorney here in Richmond, and a state legislator and a congressman. And so we felt that, of course, he should be honored here by his school. He also was on the alumni board and the board of governors of the school. So it was fitting that he be recognized. And a number of his classmates attended today's service. And then we also, after that, after the chapel service, had a networking session. And then I came over here to meet you. So that's why I was here today in Richmond.
And the networking session included students.
It did, yeah. Allowed them to ask some questions of us about what our experience was like here, and how we felt it impacted our lives, and then to ask questions about how we proceeded, college, graduate school, career, that type of thing.
That networking can be really powerful. Are you surprised that it took this long to put that network together?
I am, to a certain degree. I mean, this is something that, I've been involved on and off with the school for many, many years. And from time to time, I was like, maybe we should get together a group of the African-American alumni. I think, with what happened in Richmond here in 2020, it really galvanized the understanding of, that there are a lot of issues that can be discussed and that can be productive. And so that's why I think things started, after 2020 began to happen sort of more quickly. But I think it's good not only for the African-American students, but for the entire community to sort of understand and recognize the value that diversity has in an institution like this, which has a long and storied history, and which in many ways for a large portion of its history maybe was not that diverse, but has been for, almost 50 years now, integrated and to, demonstrate the value that type of diversity has. Because the fact is, the entire world's very diverse. I mean, as I mentioned to you, I've done business all over the world, and even today I don't travel as much, but I deal with people, all over the place, countries all over the place. And to compete in today's world, no matter what business you're in, you need to be able to deal with different types of people. And that needs to begin early. And so I think every educational institution has to have an element of diversity in it in order for it to be a fruitful education for people. And I certainly do not want to in any way disparage certain types of school which do focus on particular groups, because you do have certain religious groups that like to have their own form of education, and that is very important too. But at the same time, I think in doing that and pursuing that, it's also important to have some element of diversity so that you are able to deal in the broader world with different types of people.
I agree with everything you just said. I'd love to get your opinion here. There are some schools that seem to be going back to this notion of the same race in one dorm. It's not rampant, but it's happening, and it feels like we're maybe going the wrong direction with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you might be referring to is sort of affinity housing, right? So you have these big universities, or even not so big universities, where a particular group wants to live with that particular group. And I guess my opinion on that is that can have some value as long as it's interspersed and mixed with experience of having to live with other types of people. So I see that the idea of affinity housing, and we did at Dartmouth, we had some affinity housing. We had affinity housing for African American students. We had affinity housing for Native American students. But I think if you're going to have affinity housing, that you shouldn't spend all 4 years of your college experience living just in affinity housing. Yeah. You can have it as part of the experience, and then you need to go live with other people as well. So, you need to sort of mix it up. But I understand the reasons sometimes for affinity housing, but I think it should be just one of a number of features of a school, and it shouldn't be like the central focus. And certainly an entire school shouldn't be set up around just affinity housing.
Okay. All right, I love that answer, and that's the first time I've heard of affinity housing.
I think that's what you're referring to.
I guess I am.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that, and it can be, affinity housing can be based on a number of different things. It can be based on race, it can be based on sex, it can be based on sexual orientation, it can be based on religion. Again, the concept is that for a small portion of my educational experience, I'm going to spend some time around people that have my same interest or like me. Same thing, you have language affinity housing where people just speak French in the dorm, and the idea is that's going to enhance that particular part of my education, but it shouldn't be the entire thing.
It gives depth to the experience.
Exactly.
Where being around people that are not like you or don't have your experiences gives you more breadth.
Yes.
Fair enough. All right, we're going to close with a question that I ask most people. It is different. You've listened to a couple of these episodes. If you made it to the end of any of them, you maybe know this question's coming. You're a talk show host, one time only. You have an hour and a half to conduct your talk show. You're the host, so you get to decide who your guests are going to be. Your guests can be alive or dead. Your guests can be famous or not famous. They can be family members, friends, somebody from hundreds of years ago that you would really love to just sit down and explore their brain. Your 4 guests, and this, by the way, this is meant to be more revealing than standard conversation. Male guest, female guest, musical act, and then if you're into comedy, a comedian. Who are your 4 guests?
Male guest, Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
Female guest, let me circle back to that one.
Okay.
Musical act, Sting.
All right.
Was the comedian?
Yep.
Richard Pryor.
He's the Godfather.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to think, because I've been fascinated by so many female historical figures that have had such a tremendous impact on history. I think to ask some really interesting, I'm going to pick out two, and they're going to be a little bit unusual because they're from way back in the past. But again, I've studied quite a bit about their lives, and I just find them fascinating. I would say Cleopatra and Queen Elizabeth I.
Okay. I did not see either one of those.
Yeah. Again, I'm a history guy, so
you're definitely...
I was going to go, I went a little bit into the past in Frederick Douglass, but way into the past. But again, just because being witness, I think Cleopatra being witness to all of that history around the transfer of Rome from a republic to an empire, which was really a huge turning point in the development of the Western world. It would be fascinating to understand that what was really like, what was going through the minds of people like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony as they did what they did. And Queen Elizabeth I, I find her to be, and again, like I said, I studied British history quite a bit. She was someone who was quite interesting because, again, not born in proximity to the throne and then having to go through all those different machinations, again, at a very interesting turning point in British history, as it was changing from basically a Catholic country to a Protestant country. And again, the perspective that she would have had on that, and then eventually coming to the throne and bringing England to probably the greatest point to its history in that date. Again, just so many, I'm fascinated by people that have to deal with tremendous amounts of change, and both of those figures definitely went through a lot of changes in their lives.
And they get credit for doing it well.
They do.
Well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, George, I'm glad we got to connect, man. It's been a long time.
Yep.
I'm glad Tim was there for your speech that day, and I wish I'd been there. I mean, he was raving about it, but I appreciate you doing this, and I hope our classmates and others check this out because it was a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd also really appreciate if you'd rate and review us. You can find us at scodupodcast.com.